If you've been in Nancy Nicholas Hall at all since Dr. Barber's visit last month, you're likely aware that I'm discussing marital conflict in the home and its implications for family members. I'm happy to be here. Marital conflict is well established as a risk factor for parents and children's outcomes, directly and through changes in parenting, family relationships, and multiple family problems. How marital conflict is handled or resolved matters for the partners. Even the basic physical function of wound healing is slower following couples' conflict discussions compared to their supportive discussions. How differences are handled is a potent predictor of the relationship as well, in terms of how satisfying it is and whether it continues or ends. And marital conflict is also linked with children's emotional security, or their desire to maintain a sense of protection, safety, and security in their family. This established literature is mainly based on marital conflict as collected through measurements of self-report, on questionnaires, or trained observers' ratings of problem solving and conflict discussions held in lab settings. These methods have tended to emphasize the negative ways that couples resolve their differences, and also leave questions about about their relevance to real life. So today I'll be presenting an overview of a line of work in which we've advanced the idea that marital conflict is inevitable and probably handled well a lot of the times, and we attempted to capture a broad view of what family members experience in their lives. So I'll describe findings from studies from a collaborative line of research in which we've explored marital conflict in the home using a diary method that we developed with parents who were living with school-aged children. And our goal here has been to characterize naturalistic marital conflict as it unfolds on a momentary level in the daily lives of families. Our shorthand for that has become in the home, although these are situations that could have occurred anywhere. And I acknowledge at the outset that talking about marital conflict holds potentially negative implications or connotations, but we use that term simply to connect with this long-standing existing literature area. When we were training parents how to become observers of their momentary conversations, we never used the terms conflict, disagreement, or fight. Instead, we simply had parents report on their interactions between each other that needed some give and take to reach an agreement or a solution, even if an agreement wasn't reached. Any discussion in which the partners expressed a different point of view on something. Any situation in which one or both partners experienced some emotional tension, frustration, or anger, or any mix of the above. This naturally occurring and broadly defined conflict was captured using diary methods, which have been promoted for obtaining detailed descriptions of events as they occur in life context, while minimizing the retrospective biases of the respondents. Our sample and procedures are drawn from a larger longitudinal study on family process and child development. Mothers and fathers and their child who is participating with them attended 2 laboratory sessions, and mothers and fathers completed the diary conflict for 15 days in between the 2 sessions. Nearly all of the parents identified as European American, and most were married, and the modal family income ranged between $40,000 and $65,000 yearly. So this is a shot of part of the conflict diary. Let's see, I'll start at the top. Couple of lines ask about the context in which this interaction occurred. The middle section here shows feelings and behaviors expressed during the interaction. The bottom half, which isn't shown, has a corresponding section for feelings and behaviors used to end the interaction, given our explicit interest in conflict resolution. And then there were some ending questions asking the respondents to rate the importance of the interaction and the resolution of the interaction, and to indicate whether the target child was present for the discussion and if any other children in the family were present as well. You can see here that the respondent is rating what they were doing or feeling during the interaction as well as what their partner was doing. We provided a lot of training to parents before we sent them home to do this on their own. We provided verbal and written instructions as well as video examples of actors engaging in these behaviors. We emphasized to parents that we would like these to be completed independently, so we were really interested in mothers and fathers' perceptions of what was going on in the home. They didn't even need to consult with their partner to see whether a record should be completed or not. We left that up to each partner individually. We also encourage that these be completed right away to really maximize some of the benefits of the momentary reporting. So as you can imagine, a measure like this generates lots of data when participants brought them back into the lab. For many of the results that I'll be talking about, we used some composite categories here, and the most common ones that I'll mention are include constructive conflict expressions, depressive conflict, and angry. And those categories include behaviors and emotions that go together empirically and theoretically. So when we ask parents to do this and think about their differences in conflict very broadly defined, we found that the 116 couples who participated, the fathers brought back almost 1,300 diary reports. There were 6 fathers who indicated no conflicts occurred. All 116 mothers reported some conflict, and their total was around 1,600 reports. And you can see that mothers, on average, for example, reported about one of these broadly defined conflicts occurring per day for the 15-day reporting period. For some of the analyses that we conducted, we needed a matched sample of reports in which we needed to find the subset of reports from mothers and fathers that overlapped. So you remember we were very interested in how mothers and fathers saw the situations independently, but for some analyses we needed to be confident that we were looking at the subset of conflicts that mothers and fathers agreed on and that could be matched up. So we took a very conservative approach to matching. We only coded them as matched if the time reported by both parents overlapped directly. So we believe we took a very conservative approach to matching. So the findings based on this dyadic sample are likely underestimates. So I'll just say a word about the analytic approach that we used for most of the results. It's a quantitative approach to data analysis known as multivariate hierarchical linear modeling. And this is why we needed the matched sample. We needed to be certain that parents were reporting about the same events. This analytic strategy accounts for the repeated diary measurement and the interdependent reports. So the hierarchical part of this is that each parent could be providing multiple reports of of conflicts. So that's the hierarchical part. And then the multivariate part is that for this measure, mothers and fathers were reporting about the same thing. So it's that makes it a dyadic or multivariate approach. Many advantages or many reasons why this is the appropriate approach to use. It's the only way that you can statistically compare the results obtained for mothers and fathers. And it also allows one person's predictor variable to be used to predict the outcomes reported by the other person. Another nice feature of this approach is that it accommodated the fact that some parents had 1 or 2 matched instances and others had 5, 6, or 7. And it provides greater statistical weight to the families who returned more diaries. Okay, so this first question is just, well, when we ask parents to report their marital conflicts broadly defined that occur in the home, what are the sources of these conflicts, or what's raising these types of discussions or situations for parents? And you see in our sample, children, by quite a margin, was the #1 source of conflict for these couples. Leisure, communication, and chores followed next, and then a lot of other topics kind of all bunched together at the same rate. So you remember that all of the couples in our sample had at least one child between the ages of 8 and 16, and most had at least 2 children, so there were plenty of opportunities for decisions to be made around children, their activities, child rearing and discipline, and so on. One of her questions was, does it matter, does the topic or the reason of the conflict matter to how the conflict is expressed? So it's one thing to look and see, okay, what's the most frequent or common source of conflict? But it's, I think, a potentially more interesting and informative question to say, well, does that matter? So should we care about the topics that are discussed? And so we started with money because we hear a lot that money is the #1 source of conflict for couples. The idea for this paper came from a conference I was at where I was listening to a family scholar, and he said something like, conflicts are the #1 source of money, or money is the #1 source of conflict in the home. And that really caught my ear because I was thinking, you know, is he going to talk about other data collected in the home? And he wasn't, but it just kind of went to show how, just how commonly held this idea is. And there's lots of ways to see this just in the popular press. We saw this a lot. My HDFS colleagues who are here probably remember Dana Nixon, who is a recent graduate of our program. She's now in a marriage and family therapy program in Minnesota, and I just got an email from her less than 2 weeks ago. She said, my family systems textbook says that money is the #1 source of conflict, and there's no citation provided. Can you send me that article that we talked about? So it's just a commonly held, and I'm sure in some samples it is. But in our sample, children were #1. But anyway, so as I said, more interesting perhaps is, does it matter if we're looking at money as a topic? So just to tell you, just to set up this analysis, and it should help you understand most of the results that I'll discuss, we used money, which was one of the possible topics of conflict in the home, as the predictor of the other conflict characteristics as outcomes. So the regression equations here in HLM were simply money, yes or no, 0 or 1, predicting other topics, feelings expressed, behaviors used during all as separate outcomes. And remember, it's a dyadic analysis. So we could look at, did money predict a certain behavior according to mothers, controlling for the results from father's estimate of that association as well. Okay, so we already saw that money was not the most frequent source of conflict here. It was mentioned in 20% of the conflicts, so fairly sizable. I mean, I should mention here that we allowed parents to circle multiple topics, and most conversations did include multiple topics. We saw when we were looking at money as a topic as a predictor of the rest of the conflict characteristics, that talking about money in conflict was linked to this being an old issue or something that had come up previously. Money, so it was likely to persist and come up again. They were longer conflicts, and they were rated as more important to the relationship relative to other conflicts being discussed. And they were likely to remain unresolved. So even though discussing money was linked with a higher use of problem-solving behavior, it was also linked to agreeing to discuss it later, suggesting that couples were really trying to work through these decisions, but not able to, and needing to come back to resolve them later. And we saw that money as a topic was linked to mothers and fathers using more expressions of anger and depression conflict during the interactions. And so we thought, well, maybe one of the reasons that we so often hear that money is the most frequent source of conflict is people just remembering that these tended to be recurrent and distressing and harder to handle issues in the home. And we think this also has some implications for practitioners who are working with couples trying to make money and financial decisions, that some of these decisions and discussions are going to take a little more work and attention compared to other issues for couples. Another important topic that we explored was intimacy, and there's good reason to want to know how couples talk about intimacy, and especially their differences. Intimacy is the core of our romantic relationships and partnerships. This is what distinguishes our romantic relationships from every other type of close relationship that we have over the course of our lifetime. Intimacy was a possible topic of conflict on our diary report, and we define this as any desired or actual emotional or physical closeness or displays of affection. So even though this is the most central issue in couples relationships and really the core feature of our relationships, we knew nothing about how or even whether couples discuss intimacy conflicts in their daily lives. Our results from the diary showed that intimacy conflicts were relatively discrete. So if you were having a conflict in the home concerning intimacy, you were unlikely to be talking about most of the other topics like children, work, social events, and so on. These intimacy conflicts were also relatively infrequent. They occurred, according to mothers and fathers reports, in less than 10% of the interactions that occurred in the home. Interestingly, even though about a third of the couples endorsed intimacy conflicts as occurring, they were almost all matched up when we went to do the matching task. So couples were very aware of when they were having these discussions, and they were seemed to be very salient discussions. When we looked to see how discussing intimacy during conflict in the home predicted the other conflict characteristics, similar to our approach in the money paper, we found very encouragingly that talking about intimacy and conflict was linked to higher levels of importance and also to more problem solving and positivity. So overall, these were encouraging results and suggested to us that we did indeed capture a very broad view of conflict that occurs in the home, so we were picking up some positive discussions as well. However, there was an exception. We also collected information from partners on their psychological well-being, and we found that when fathers reported having higher levels of depression symptoms, just in general, not in conflict, but just in general, discussing intimacy during conflict in the home made these conflicts more difficult for both mothers and fathers, who both expressed greater angry and depression conflict in the home. So turning to children's experience of marital conflict in the home, we know from the existing literature that even very young children can detect and respond in reliable ways to marital conflict. A recent study by Tina DeRocher-Schudlick, who is a graduate colleague of mine at Notre Dame, looked at how parents discuss marital conflict in a lab in the presence of their infant. The infants ranged from 6 to 14 months. She had one team of her coders describe what the parents were doing during this situation, and they coded things like the positive and negative expressions from the diaries. She had another separate team of coders describe what the infants were doing during the parents' discussion. Things like how much they were attending to the parents, how much they were playing, how content they were. And she found that parents who engaged in more negative and depressive conflict in this lab task had infants who at the same time were more preoccupied or staying attuned to the parents' discussion, and they were less likely to be playing and more likely to be crying during the interaction. We see these associations at very young ages. And the existing literature on this shows that exposure to parents' marital conflict is an established environmental risk factor along many outcome domains. But again, most of this work has been based on either global retrospective questionnaires that parents complete or lab-based procedures, leaving questions about children's exposure and responding to conflict on a daily level and in their naturally occurring family life. So here is a shot of our child response to the parents' marital conflict. Our conflict measure, I forgot to mention, was just a paper and pencil measure, and this child rating was simply the back form of the parents' marital diary. So when parents indicated that their target child in the study was present for their marital conflict, meaning the child could either see or hear the interaction, parents were instructed to complete the back side of this form, which collected information on how concerned the child seemed during the parents' interaction, the child's emotions during the interaction, as well as the child's behaviors. Similar to the parents' record, we also collected information on what the child was doing and feeling at the end of the interaction as well. Parents received the same training on how to complete this, and they were told, not to talk to their child about this. We were interested in how parents see the situation, and they didn't need to even let the child know that they were doing this, and didn't need to ask the child if they weren't sure about this. Similar to the parents' marital record, we often use some composites, so I'll just mention a couple of the composites that you'll hear about. We looked at behavioral regulation, which was when children tried to get involved in the conflict, so doing things like taking sides, comforting a parent, interrupted, anything where they were trying to kind of get into the conflict. There was also behavioral dysregulation, things like yelling at us, crying, misbehaving, so where they were also behaving but in a way that indicated their dysregulation, perhaps not so much getting involved. Mothers and fathers, mothers again reported a higher number of records here. Mothers reported that children were exposed to 5 conflict discussions, again broadly defined, over the course of the 15-day period. Fathers were a little less. There were a little over 10% of both mothers and fathers indicated that children were exposed to no conflict in the home. I did many of these training sessions for teaching parents how to complete the diaries at home, and a lot of times I would go through all of the parents' conflict information and go through the whole diary, and no one ever said anything. People were pretty on board with the fact that they were going to have marital conflict. No one ever said, oh, we don't need to take these home with us. But a lot of times I would get to the child training part, and the parents would say, oh, we don't fight in front of our children. We would never have one of these interactions in front of our children, even though we were keeping it very general. So I simply said, well, it's my job to get you through the whole training. Take it or leave it. If you don't need it, don't worry about reporting it. But at least you'll know. And as we saw, most mothers and fathers indicated that they did have conflict in front of their children, based on the reports they provided. And I never followed up in this way, but I'm sure if I had asked them, okay, well, I'm sure this rarely happens, but if you were to have one of these interactions in front of your children, how would it be? What would it look like? And I think most parents would just say, well, we try to handle things better when children are around. We try and keep things more under control, or use more productive ways of handling conflict. And so that's what we were interested in testing here. And I think the McPhersons do a good job of showing that hypothesis, so that's all I'll say about that. In terms of what the analyses look like, remember I said that we had parents indicate if their target child was present or if any other children were present. So we simply combined those to create a variable, were any children present, yes or no? And that variable became the predictor of all of the other conflict characteristics. So Did child presence predict the topics that were discussed? Did the child presence predict the parents' feelings or behaviors that were used? Parents were correct that they did try to shield their children from conflict. About 2/3 of conflict occur in child absence. 1/3 of the conflict occurred when children were present. According to the diary reports, conflicts in front of children were less likely to include verbal and physical affection and less likely to be rated as positive. Parents endorsed, both they and their spouse, using more personal insult, more hostility, more aggression directed towards objects. Mothers were more likely to withdraw at the end of these child-present conflicts. And both parents reported using more physical distress when children were present. And physical distress was something we defined as any crying, trembling, or shaking. This is by the parents. So both parents endorsed doing that. So it seems like not only were children missing out on the positive ways of handling conflict that occurs in the home, but the behaviors that we were seeing and the emotions that we were seeing parents engage in are problematic and hold potentially problematic implications for children's emotional security in their family. For example, we know that child-related conflict is more likely to induce anxiety and guilt in children, and the conflicts that children saw were often more likely about them. We conducted a series of studies looking at how children's exposure to this conflict not only affects how the parents handle it, but also how children feel during the conflict and in their broader adjustment. And I'll focus here just on some analyses that looked at children's aggressive responding to conflict in the home. Aggressive responding on the child's part included things like yelling, misbehaving, and being aggressive. Parents' negative behaviors and emotions during the marital interaction predicted more momentary child responding in an aggressive way. Conflicts concerning children or marital themes, so when parents were talking about things like marital commitment or intimacy, those topics also predicted more child aggressive responding. We also saw that children who engaged in any aggressive responses during their parents' marital conflict were significantly more likely to score in the externalizing range on the child behavior checklist. So just showing some links between what happens in the home on a momentary level and children's adjustment. My colleague Marcia Gokimori is very interested in the positive aspects of family functioning and what makes families resilient and work well. And so she was very eager to focus on the conflict resolution part of the diary. So this is when we had parents say, okay, think about how the interaction ended. What were you doing? How were you feeling? And then when your child was present, what were they doing and feeling at the end? So just thinking about that ending point of the interaction. We were very heartened to see that almost half of the interactions that children observe included compromise. And so again, suggesting that this method captures a very broad view of what parents and children experience in the home. And we can look at some other behaviors that were common resolution behaviors. Parental withdrawal was directly linked with children seeming more concerned and acting in more behavior-regulated ways, so those behaviors that showed they were trying to get into the conflict, as well as more behavioral dysregulation, so acting out in ways showing that they were affected by the conflict. Interestingly, when withdrawal was paired with the parents expressing positive emotions, these behavioral responses by the children went away. So parents withdrawing, but in the context of positivity, wasn't sort of took away some of those effects on children's responding. We also looked at whether apology is a sufficient conflict resolution behavior. So, apology was a fairly common way that conflicts ended, and we saw that child presence was linked to mothers actually engaging in more apology. Well, it turns out that apology directly did not predict any child responding. So at first glance, it looked like apology wasn't doing anything. However, when we ran interactions between parents expressing apology and the emotions that they were reported feeling, then we were able to see how apology relates to child responding during conflict. Specifically, when mothers were engaging in apology and had higher levels of sadness and fear, children showed more regulation behavior, so more trying to get involved into the conflict, things like taking sides and helping out. When fathers expressed apology with higher levels of sadness or anger, children were acting more dysregulated, so being aggressive, yelling, and so on. So together, the findings suggest that children are very astute witnesses to marital conflict in the home, picking up on both the emotions and behaviors and how they go together, as well as what topics are discussed, in order to understand the meaning of the conflict and to evaluate the implications for their emotional security. Currently, I'm extending the study of marital conflict in the home to couples who have recently launched their grown children from the household. This time in couples development is really unique, and it's also relatively understudied. The few existing findings from couples in the empty nest are contradictory, with some results showing that marital satisfaction increases at this time, but other studies showing that couples are more likely to separate at this point. So I believe that understanding how couples are handling their differences that occur in the home could be one way to help reconcile this literature. So I'm expecting that the naturalistic conflict that occurs around the time of the empty nest transition will have current and long-term implications for both the spouse's well-being as well as their relationship. And I expect that there will be changes in the relative importance and frequency of the conflicts, and that it may change as the family transitions change too. So I'm sure a lot of these couples who are in the empty nest that we're studying will soon or eventually become boomerang parents, and so we'll extend to that type of family as well. And a very exciting part of this study for me is we're now collecting these diaries using iPad minis, and all of the data will be directly entered for us, and after entering 2,900 of the paper diaries, that's exciting. So I'm very happy to be working on that with current students here, and I appreciate their efforts. I also acknowledge the families who participated in these studies, as well as my collaborators in this line of work. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Sarah.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about two different things. One, I was interested in whether the amount of conflict or the kind of conflict that couples had, if it changed over the 15 days, like if that was kind of a treatment where it might make them be more reflective or something, and that might change.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was wondering about was concordance and discordance in the couple's reporting of events, and kind of using the concordance or discordance to sort of predict.
Okay, that's a great point. So let's start with the time. So did couples' interactions change, maybe as a function of their reporting or just for some other reason over the 15 days? And we never found time effects. So day of reporting and number of interaction, those variables had very little bearing on the outcome variables. We also have a paper where we looked at couples' lab discussions in the first visit and in their second visit. And I mentioned this as part of a broader study, so we also have some couples who didn't do the reporting at home, but also had the two problem-solving discussions in their lab visits. And we didn't see any differences in the lab-based discussions based on, as a function of whether or not the couple did the home reporting. That's not a, perfect test of that question, but it's one of the only consistent things we have across couples who did do the home reporting and couples who didn't. So I don't know. I mean, I do think it must have sparked something in parents' minds. They probably were more thoughtful or more aware of certain behaviors, and certainly they acknowledged that sometimes when they came in for their second visit, but it didn't seem to change their reporting. At least we hope. So, and then your other question about the concordance and discordance, I think it's really interesting. So mothers, consistently reported more interactions than their partners. When we use the matched sample, we're excluding a lot of data. Almost half of the mothers' reports alone don't get considered. The patterns that we've looked at, we don't replicate the analyses by running the statistical test in the match sample and then verifying that they hold up when they're separate, simply because for most of the questions it really is most appropriate to not inflate the number of tests and to just use that one reduced sample. But when we've looked at descriptive statistics, we're pretty confident that the data at least are similar, even if the patterns might not hold up. But as an example, when you look at the graph of the topics during the conflicts, it's exactly the same when you look at parents when we look at the full sample. The same, child is by far and away the highest number and so on. And so those types of patterns are the same. We don't know if all the results would hold up, but because we're looking so broadly defined, it's probably not the difference in the number that's important, right? But are they different on, not mentioning the really positive, the well-handled conflicts, or the poorly handled conflicts? And so there's probably some moderation there by what are they not matched on, rather than just numbers. So I think it could be done. I think it would be, there'd be a couple steps needed to kind of characterize the conflicts or something, but I think it could be done.
Really capture the concept of his and hers marriage.
Yes.
What are they each seeing going on in the home?
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. That's a good point. Cliff?
Does the diary allow you to collect information on escalation or de-escalation?
Excellent point. No. So that's a great point, and it would be really interesting. So we're asking parents to complete, after the fact, what are all of the topics you discussed, what are the behaviors that happen? We have no idea which came first. I mean, we tried to, and that's really hard to do unless you're observing, right? But we tried to get some of that by having a separate section on resolution. And the emotions are the same across during and ending. They're highly linked, but it's not a perfect correlation. So parents they were kind of thinking of a different point. And so that's the best we can do, is we're pretty sure that what happened on the bottom of the form did come at the end, but if parents endorsed, a couple of positive behaviors up on top and one negative behavior, you could we often tried to look at it and you can think, well, this probably happened first, and then the problem solving came after that personal insult or something, but you never know, right? And we Yeah, that's one thing that we can't get at. Now, having 15-day reporting, we can, kind of going back to Sarah's point, we can line these up over the 15 days, and look for more specific trends that way. So that's another way you can look at time, but not in the event level, unfortunately.
I was wondering, did you collect the ages of the child? So, for instance, like in adolescence, I would imagine like more conflict occurring maybe compared to younger children? Or even there's difference in responses and difference in preference?
Absolutely, yes. So yes. So we know there was a target child between the ages of 8 and 16. We know if they were present, and if they were, how they responded. We also know the ages of the other children in the home. We didn't go, we weren't so specific as to say if other children were present, which ones. I think that would have been interesting. So for any conflict, we can test your questions and they're interesting. For some of them would have to be excluded because if other children were present, we wouldn't know how old they were. I have colleagues who are especially interested in the child responding. I've tended to focus more on what the parents were doing, but yeah, so I think those questions are definitely there. And Linda, thanks.
I was particularly interested in the intimacy-related conflicts, and I was trying to just think about what that meant, and it's oftentimes that intimacy word is a signal for a set. A lot of other conflict.
Yep, that was part. Yeah, exactly. That was part of it.
But it was sort of, so it got me thinking about, did you train them in what each of those words meant and what should go in that category, and specifically included sex? Because I'm looking at the rating form, it says type of interaction. And so I was just wondering whether they understood that.
Yep, we provided definitions of all of the topics. For intimacy, we did mention physical, sex, emotional closeness. So we were trying to go beyond sex only and capture the emotional closeness as well. But yeah, so it's in there, and most of the literature, you're right, focuses on sex.
That you're just broader to define it.
Yeah. Which I think if you look at how theorists describe intimate relationships, they often say the potential for intimacy can define these types of relationships as well. So.
Do you have data on how the participants are chosen, or their income level? Well, you said income level, but education, job, race, ethnicity?
Yes, we do have all that. It was a range. Yeah, it was a range of education. I know that jobs a range as well. They were selected from community postings. School letters were a big source of recruitment, and the families came from Indiana and Michigan, just small to medium-sized cities. Karen?
Fascinating work, Laura.
Thanks, Karen.
So you've got data for both parents and their perceptions of their kids' response. Is your data at the point where you could give any advice to parents about conflict in the home in terms of the effects it might have on kids?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And yes, some work has come out of this lab. Since I've left, they have conducted some psychoeducational workshops with families in the community with younger children, ages 4 to 8, and they've done some follow-ups to see if these workshops matter. The workshops point out that children do perceive behaviors and emotions together, so it's not enough to just kind of, sarcastically say sorry, for example, or to say everything's fine, but then roll your eyes. Children seem to be picking up, at least the older children were picking up on both the emotional and verbal messages, and also to think about the topics as well. Of course, I think conflicts are unavoidable, and so the message would never be to not, to hold your conflict until later, but if a difference comes up between the parents, the children are likely picking up on that, and so do what you can in this situation to use it as a situation that can promote children's problem-solving behavior and seeing good ways of handling conflict. And also then to try and follow up and let children know that even if a difference occurred and even if it did become, a more negative interaction, to let children know that it's okay, they're not to blame, that the family security is still strong. I think it's tempting, when other people are around to try and minimize the difference or cover up the disagreement, and we think that that's probably why the disagreements were actually more negative, because that takes a lot of effort to just to control those emotions and behaviors when you're in the heat of a discussion, but rather maybe just try and embrace it and use it as an example and save your energy for working out the difference in a positive way rather than being so concerned about who's present for it. I think there are some ways that this could continue to be translated, and I still think there's more work to be done, broadening the types of families, but yeah, I think there are some starting points here for sure. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you. I don't see anyone here to end it, so I'll just end. Thank you very much.